Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion by the SPJ International Community Forum. One quick question or one quick request for everybody. If you are joining us tonight, it'd be very helpful to tell us in the chat function where you're watching us from. It helps to explore how far the reach of this group is. Good evening. My name is Steve Geimann. I'm a former editor at Bloomberg News in London and Washington, D.C. I'm a resident of Washington. And in 1996-97, I was president of the Society of Professional Journalists nationally. And welcome to another IC Talk sponsored by the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists. The international community is made up of journalists that encourage press freedom around the world. We use these one-on-one conversations to dig a little deeper into issues affecting journalists around the world. And sometimes, like today, it's with an expert in a field that has local and global implications. We hope you learn, grow, and get information that will help and inspire you in your work going forward. The format tonight is simple. The guest and I will have a conversation. I encourage you to ask questions as the discussion goes along. Please use the Q&A feature, the question and answer feature of Zoom, if you want to ask a question of our guest. I'll read the question for you. Please be short and concise. We want to give as many people as possible a chance to ask questions. Reserve the Zoom chat feature to communicate with Dan Kubisky, who's behind the scenes tonight making this all possible. That is, if you have any technical questions about the program. We will be recording the session and put it on our YouTube channel so people who could not be here today will be able to learn from our guest. And this is our guest, Kevin Goldberg. He's the First Amendment specialist at the Freedom Forum. Before joining the Freedom Forum, he practiced media law for more than 25 years, during which time he served as the legal counsel to, among others, the News Leaders Association, formerly known as the American Society of News Editors, the World Press Freedom Committee, and the Global Investigative Journalism Network. He has also spoken at conferences or at events sponsored by the United States Department of State and various nonprofit organizations in more than a dozen countries around the world. He's our guest this evening to talk about the First Amendment, the threats to press freedom and democracy around the world, including threats here in this country. Kevin, thanks very much for being with us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. This is going to be great.
You know, it's interesting that we're doing this discussion on the 14th of December. The 15th of December is the 230th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, those 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States that enshrine the language, those 45 words of the First Amendment that include press freedom and freedom of speech. So this discussion tonight is very relevant as we come up to that round numbered milestone for the Bill of Rights. And it also comes just a week after the White House sponsored a summit on democracy, including more than 100 nations being represented, some nations not at the table because of their current human rights policies. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the significance of having a democratic summit at a time like this. What does it say about where we stand as a country and where the rest of the world stands in relation to democracy and more specifically, freedom of the press and free speech rights?
Well, I do think it's important. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it is a very important, both symbolic and actual step to re-engaging with the world and reestablishing America's, I think, leadership on freedom of expression issues. We are not, and let's be very clear, we are not and have not been for a long time the world leader on free expression. Despite the existence of our First Amendment, we, like many others, could do things better. But we are a leader, we are a model. Others do look to the United States to see what we do. And we've always engaged and brought our ideas out for others who want to learn from them, both indirectly, again, through the modeling and directly through training. And I think both of those aspects are encapsulated in the Summit for Democracy.
So you're familiar with some of the initiatives that were outlined during the summit, specifically the press issues, the protection for journalists, the work that the USAID is going to be doing on protecting journalists. How do you think that's going to help with the spread of free speech and free press around the world?
Well, okay, so you're talking about, I think one good resource for people would be to look at the speech that Secretary of State Blinken gave in the opening of the summit. I think it's about 6 minutes long, where he outlined four of those actions, which are to make some necessary reforms at home, specifically looking at some of the policies of the Department of Justice with regard to searching journalist records, and to engaging with journalists in courts of law, subpoenaing journalists, how the Department of Justice will both procedurally and substantively seek to gain information from journalists. There was also another kind of less heralded action earlier this summer, by the way, where the Department of Justice made it clear that they're going to do more to protect journalists, I think, involved in protests, who are monitoring and reporting on protests, which is very important, especially for journalists of color, who I think were swept up in a lot of arrests during the past 2 years of protests. So that's one thing that they're doing at home. But most of the efforts are, and that is again going back to the modeling. What are we doing? What have we been criticized on a lot that we can do better as a country, and say, look, now you need to follow suit. But other things we are doing more directly in terms of support internationally, I think he outlined are funding independent journalism and public media in other countries, which is absolutely necessary to ensure the viability of independent media in the face of both regulatory and legal pressures, as well as economic pressures, both those that are endemic to journalism around the world, but heightened in other countries where the economic situation isn't as strong, and where the government can then take advantage of that to shut down independent media. The country has established, we're going to establish litigation support for media entities in other countries. Again, we're feeling the pressure, the legal pressures from their governments. And finally, spotlighting the importance of journalists and attacks on journalists. Very specifically here, naming names, engaging in sanctions. Again, this goes back to certain things we've seen in recent years, such as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I always pronounce that name wrong, and I apologize if I did it again here. But I think taking explicit, concrete action is very important. And he also noted investing in the rule of law, which I think is one of the biggest issues that face journalists in other countries, and separates the U.S. protections for journalists. The U.S. strength of the First Amendment is backed by the rule of law in a way that doesn't exist in other countries. So hopefully we can establish and reestablish that in certain places where there's been a rollback overseas.
What has precipitated that rollback? Is it just the rise of authoritarian governments, or is something else at play that has eroded those protections?
I think it is the lack of those protections to begin with overall. But I do think there has been a rise of authoritarianism overseas, and a savviness that allows for the undermining of rule of law. I think one example would be Russia, and I think we were going to talk about Russia anyway, in light of other recent events. But one of the things that was noted is that in the rise of authoritarianism in Russia, and the crackdown on independent media, the pressures, the physical, the legal pressures, the censorship of journalists in Russia, one thing that cannot be kind of glossed over is that when Vladimir Putin established himself as essentially a ruler for life, extending his term in office as far out as 2036, that was also accompanied by his, kind of hand-picking of judges. So at that moment, the rule of law is gone. I had a mentor, Dick Schmidt, who said that while the First Amendment he still believed was the greatest thing this country ever produced, the second greatest thing, or the second most important thing, was the independent federal judiciary that exists at the federal level. And I think that he's right. That cannot be overstated as a means of ensuring that laws are applied even-handedly, that rights of the minority parties are considered, and that that separation of powers remains intact.
So in a place like Russia, and we can also bring the Philippines into this discussion, because as you said, one of the other events in the last couple of months came to its culmination last week. It was the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to two journalists. It's the first time since the 1930s that
Yeah.
the Nobel Peace Prize Committee has recognized the journalists, and they cited the work of two, Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Dmitry Andreevich Mutov in Russia, for their work at trying to keep the government to account. In both countries, that's been very difficult. You cite the Putin example, Duterte in the Philippines. Maria needed court permission just to leave the Philippines and travel to Oslo to take part in the ceremony. These two are really just the tip of the iceberg, I guess you could say, that the kinds of work that journalists outside the United States are doing is heroic in some cases, and as in Kamal Khashoggi's case, cause for death. Is it enough to give a Peace Prize award? Is it enough for the United States to set up these kind of initiatives? Is there something bigger, greater that needs to be done to stop these attacks on journalists and to make it possible to have an independent media around the world?
Well, I think it's impossible for us to unilaterally stop the attacks on journalists in other countries, especially when I'll note we have, again, talk about backsliding, had these issues reach our shores to the extent that we had never seen in the past. Thankfully, not nearly as bad as they are in Russia, where seven journalists have been killed in the past 10 years, according to Reporters Without Borders, and 37 since 2000. That was the most recent information I was able to find from their website. And in the Philippines, 33 journalists have been killed in the past 10 years and 15 just in the past 5 since 2016. This information, again, may be a little dated. Now, we don't have journalists being killed in the United States. And this is something that's very close to our borders. Mexico, this is one of the biggest problems facing journalists in Mexico, are targeted killings of journalists, doing their daily work and reporting. I don't think we'll ever stop that. But the more work we can put into it, hopefully the more we can do to lessen it, to build the respect back up for journalists amongst the public, to shine a light on this, and to bring the pressures of government, I think, to in other ways, to improve the situation for journalists and improve the situation for the public in all of these countries. I'll say that hand in hand with that, I think we also have to not only look at the punishments, but also the carrots. And in this way, I would talk about training, which we really haven't done a lot of in the past few years either. And I think is very helpful as well in terms of improving the situations, literally both physical and legal, for a lot of the journalists in a lot of these countries.
So with the attacks on journalists, and the United States has had not as many as the Philippines, and your numbers, one death of a journalist. I got into this business 45 years ago, and I shouldn't have to worry about my life every time I go out on a story. And yet you look at these foreign reporters who are putting their lives on the line every day. Even if they don't go out into the field, their lives are under attack because they're writing critically of the government. They're writing things that are making people in power uncomfortable, and that it shouldn't be that way. And I think you're right. There needs to be more activity, more training, but also journalists in countries like the United States do have to rise up. They do have to back their colleagues in other nations. When I was president of the journalism group a quarter of a century ago, I tried to make it my daily goal to remind people that the work of journalists outside the United States was much harder than anything we had to do in this country because their lives are on the line. And that's a role that SPJ can play. I know. Is it a role that government can instigate beyond what the Biden summit did this past week?
I think so. I think the Biden summit has provided some idea, as as Secretary of State Blinken said, there are things that the government is intent on doing, sanctioning, shining a light on these attacks, making them known, shaming governments. It could go, I don't know what you're going to do beyond sanctions. I don't, at the same time, there are, thankfully, you're right, we have fewer attacks here. So another thing we can do is perhaps model that here, because I do not doubt in the least that the verbal, emotional, and physical attacks on journalists that have happened in this country to an unprecedented extent in the past decade. Now, granted, not nearly as bad as what happens overseas,
Right.
but unprecedented here, gives license to leaders in other countries, gives license to businesses in other countries, gives license to people in other countries to do the same. When they see a reporter in Montana body slammed for asking a question of a candidate for federal office, they see little to no repercussion, a misdemeanor. They see praise. What do you think that does overseas when they say, well, look, this happens in America? I think we need to reestablish ourselves very clearly here at home as well.
I remember the attack on the reporter in Montana.
Greg Gianforte was the congressman's name. Let's not leave that out. Shame him.
Exactly. And the outcry among the press was not as sharp and as vociferous as it could have been, because these kinds of assaults, when people are out there doing their job, trying to inform the public, shouldn't stand. And again,
I think they were shocked to some extent here. And that's kind of, I think people were like, wait, did that just happen?
Right.
Was a journalist in the United States literally assaulted by a candidate for office? That doesn't happen here. But you know what? Sadly, now it does. We need to stop that, and we need to make it clear to our own citizens and everyone around the world that we're not going to stand for it, and they shouldn't either.
Yeah, it's the First Amendment goes pretty far in protecting the press against any sort of government intrusion. It hasn't yet reached the criminal activity. When somebody assaults another person, that goes to basic criminal law, and they have to be. I would like to see it be enforced, multiplied by what would happen if the person wasn't out doing their job, trying to inform the public.
A bill has in recent years been introduced in Congress that never gets very far, called the Journalist Protection Act. That would do just that. Actually, would create heightened penalties for attacking a journalist who's doing their work with the intention of essentially silencing that journalist.
And dare I ask why that hasn't made it to the president's desk in the last couple of years?
I mean, let's just call it the legislative process. I mean, I don't think there's there are a lot of priorities that have occurred. And of course, in the last 2 years, we've had a global pandemic that has really, refocused the efforts of Congress to a lot of things. I'm not saying this isn't important, of course, but really there is a lot of work to be done.
And, there's a subcurrent in society today where the press is not viewed quite as favorably as it was. Is it 40 years ago when the Washington Post helped expose the corruption during the Nixon administration and the Nixon campaign for re-election in 72? There was an explosion of investigative reporting, investigative journalism. The press was held in very high esteem because they helped protect the democracy. They helped protect the nation from these abuses of power. And now, 45 years later, the press is not held in quite the same high esteem. And I'm sure that's another reason why it's not been a legislative priority for lawmakers and for others to try to get this kind of legislation through.
Do you know how low, I'm looking for the right term here, the degree to which people actually disdain journalists in this country right now it's frightening. Our organization, the Freedom Forum, in September released a big survey that we had done the year before in the summer of 2020 called the Where America Stands survey.
Mm-hmm.
Interviewed 3,000 people across the country on 200 different questions related to the First Amendment. Test their knowledge, their opinions. 41, I think it was something like 41% of respondents didn't hold the press in high regard, and a number actually believed that that journalists are a threat to the First Amendment. I think it was 14% said journalists are a threat to the First Amendment, which is, again, it's sort of mind-boggling where we've come from Watergate to this.
It is, and it gives me chills as a longtime journalist to see that what I do is held in such low esteem by the public. And I wonder if that's the doing of the press. Is it the doing of the media? Or is it something that's occurred because what we do and how we do it has changed so dramatically? It's no longer sitting in front of the TV at night watching one of three television networks or getting a morning newspaper from one or two sources. It's now a free-for-all in the electronic social media realm, and not every journalist practices their craft in the same way.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a lot of factors. And actually, I flipped the numbers on this, by the way. It's 41% think that journalists are a threat to the First Amendment. 14% don't have trust in journalists, right? 14% have trust in journalists.
Okay.
41% actually say they're a threat to the First Amendment. I think there are a lot of factors that play into this mistrust. Part of it is, but ultimately, I think to me, it comes down to a lack of connection. And this itself derives from a number of factors. What I see is people who say they hate the media or they hate journalists. But when you ask them about their local journalists, they tend to be much more positive. And that's because they have a connection to those journalists. They see those journalists as peers, as friends, as members of the community, as people who are ingrained in the community, as people who want to help the community. I think, and that has been lost. That's been lost for a couple of reasons. One, there is now the rise of internet journalism, of citizen journalists, which blurs the line not only between the quote unquote professional journalists, the ones with, or perhaps people with longstanding journalism training that have themselves editors and rigorous standards and processes versus people who may not go through it. Some do, but some don't go through those standards and processes. That creates kind of a bigger monolith of what might be considered journalism and pulls in some things that may not be as trustworthy. The economic side, and that has also had an effect on the economic side. And the economic side has undercut that community journalism. We know that there are news deserts in a lot of these communities, and within communities that even have strong news media, there is less coverage of city council, of the courthouses. I think that's very important because the I get it effect, the I connect effect, the I see the benefit to me effect is gone.
The most troubling report I've seen in the last couple of months has equated the rise of corruption in local governments to the decline of local newspapers. I think The Atlantic did a very long story about this.
Yep.
And other publications have looked at the balance when reporters stop covering the school board, the city council, the zoning board. Nobody's being held to account, and government officials can do what they wish. And the public doesn't see that. They're not making that connection. And I think it even goes beyond, they know somebody at the newspaper, they know somebody at the TV or radio station. They just don't want to know about what's going on. They don't care enough to support the work that these journalists are doing. And that's another part of the equation. But there's one other thing I think that's happened. We've just come out of 4 years of a leadership in Washington, an administration in the White House that held the press, the media in high contempt, and went so far as to call it an enemy of the people. How much of the public's perception has been shaped by what the former president, Donald Trump, did while he was in the White House?
I'm sure a lot has. I think you can only hear that phrase said so many times before, if you are a supporter of Donald Trump, you believe it. And I think the point was to delegitimize the media and the messages, to create a disinformation campaign, which, bringing us back to the topic of the night, is something that has been occurring overseas for years and years and years. That is the playbook for an authoritarian leadership.
So did Trump's approach to the press and his approach to power accelerate some of these initiatives, some of these leaders in foreign countries? I'm thinking of Viktor Orban, maybe Mahendra Modi in India. How much of a impetus or a catalyst was Trump's work here for what's been going on in other parts of the world?
I think like many things in a global society, it's run both ways. I think he took a lot of the ideas and implemented them. He found a lot of these ideas and implemented them from places overseas. But I do think, as I said, it's given license to people like Viktor Orban to do this. And we're seeing it in other countries. I mean, we've seen this in Latin America, for instance, in a lot of the countries, the same disinformation campaigns. I can think back to, and we've seen them for years, and we are seeing them just continually running through. Only now they seem more legitimate because they're happening here in the United States. So this is what I'm talking about. To give you an example, it was right around this. I was looking back. Thank you in a way for Facebook memories, because I was looking back to a series of emails I would get, and I would mockingly post them to my Facebook account from the Ministry of Information of Venezuela after I had done an international trip with the American Society of News Editors to Caracas in 2008 that culminated in a meeting with Hugo Chavez. And we all ended up on the Ministry of Information's mailing list. First tip, by the way, is never trust a country that has a Ministry of Information. That is one thing I've distinctly learned in my many travels overseas.
Orwellian.
Yes. But after this, as Chavez became ill, as Chavez had cancer, we were on their mailing list, and we would get these emails telling us how everything is fine. Yes, Chavez was post-operative, but he was evolving well, and there's nothing to fear. Oh, sure, he's going to Cuba for medical treatment, but he'll be back soon. And, the next thing you know, he's dead. Mm-hmm. And it was just get ahead of the message, delegitimize the independent media. Here's the truth, believe the truth. We are the Ministry of Information, as you said, Orwellian. That's been going on for years. Now, once the United States did it, it became more accepted in many of these countries. I'm sure there were people that didn't question it. And I know there were leaders that pointed to the US and said, we're not doing anything differently than they do. And they have the First Amendment. They've always been the standard bearer. Why are you questioning our methods?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that's occurred in the 4 years that Trump was in the White House. The media's approval got to be lower and lower. How long will it take? I mean, I guess some of our credibility has returned. How much damage was done, and how long will it take to restore, first in this country with the respectability and the credibility of the press, but then more broadly, how you can stop authoritarian regimes in other countries when they look back at the United States and say, that didn't work so well?
I don't want to put too much of a damper on either part of it. I will say, let me take this. The idea of reestablishing ourselves is not as simple as flipping a switch and it's done. I once heard this put very well by a former counsel to President Obama, Norm Eisen, who talked about, in the context of open government and access to information, that reversing the policies of the Bush administration, who had really taken a lot of steps to be, to be a little more, to be more secretive. Now, again, the Obama administration came in, said they were going to be the most transparent administration in history, which was, in my mind, a silly thing to say, because they were never going to live up to it, and in many ways did not. But they had a commitment from the outset to do this, and I think perhaps setting the table for some of what was to follow. He said, changing government policy on this level is not as simple as turning the boat around. It's more like steering a fleet of battleships around, which means these are big ships, and sometimes you actually have to continue in the wrong direction as they come all the way around here and come back. So it's going to take time. How long, we don't know. I fear that some of this damage could almost be generational. And I've used this example when I've gone overseas. I've done many programs for the United States Department of State and for nonprofits in various countries that did not at the time have a Freedom of Information Act or Right to Know law, public information law, whatever you want to call it, but let's just call it a Freedom of Information Act. And one thing that the State Department would do was have a discretionary budget for embassies to put on programs related to topics fostering democracy, such as freedom of expression, such as access to information. You would be able to choose an expert. I use that in quotes because I was a person who was brought into at least, I think, 8 of these countries to talk. And a couple of times we were rather successful. I can tell you that in the Maldives, I'm not going to say at all that it was my doing, but in the Maldives, 2 months after I got to the country and did this speaking toward legislators, journalists, judges, the public, college students especially. And one person in particular was the Speaker of the House of Representatives of that country. 2 months later, they passed their first Freedom of Information Act. Does that mean we're good? No. You actually have to, I think, inculcate those values to a society to a degree where I would warn these people that the implementation will take years and the execution will take longer, perhaps generational. People who have grown up knowing only secrecy, it's going to take some time for these values to replace the old way. And I fear it won't happen here because we do have a history of freedom of expression. But I think it's going to take us some time, more than just a year, a summit for democracy, a re-engagement with the world in the open government partnership to accomplish that. You really have to change hearts and minds.
So the Maldives, small country, but a positive step. Where else have these positive steps, I guess, green shoots, if you will, of democratic movements occurring around the world? Where else has it happened like the Maldives? Are there examples where little seedlings can, become big oaks that begin to infect other countries that don't have such open governments?
Well, yeah, I'll look to another example that I have experience with, which is the concept of criminal libel. Sometimes in the Latin American world, it's called desiccato. And it's something that, again, is foreign in the United States. It takes a minimal form and a very extreme form in some of these countries. Desiccato being pretty much the extreme form. The minimal form is having criminal penalties for defamation. Now, this is something that's foreign in the United States because in our system of law, defamation is a civil tort. The purpose is not so much to punish, but to reestablish the reputation of the person harmed. So the reason we don't have criminal penalties, aside from the fact that it is a vastly overbroad and therefore unconstitutional method of punishing someone for their speech, is that it doesn't accomplish what we want it to accomplish. It doesn't set the individual necessarily right in a financial sense. But in many of these countries overseas, I could be thrown in jail for defaming someone. More importantly, in some of these countries, you have the concept of insult laws. Again, this is what is really more appropriately termed desiccato in Spanish-speaking countries. And in those situations, you can be criminally punished for insulting the honor of a head of state, of a national religion, of the flag, even if what you're saying is true. Now, these were prevalent worldwide for a long time, even in Western democracies. France had a desiccato law in its books and used it regularly. But we've seen a rollback. The trend has been both judicially through the international tribunals such as the European Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to strike down convictions of journalists and others who have written critically or insulted heads of state. But also, I think a lot of the countries, especially here in the Western democracies of Europe, have legislatively repealed these laws. So that is very much a favorable outcome that we've seen, I think, over the past 20 years.
Just a reminder to those of you who are watching our discussion tonight, our guest is Kevin Goldberg, a First Amendment specialist at the Freedom Forum. Before joining the Freedom Forum, he practiced media law for more than 25 years, during which time he served as the legal counsel to, among others, the News Leaders Association, the World Press Freedom Committee, and the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And we're talking about the threats to a free press, the role of the First Amendment, and just in general, the erosion of democracy and press rights and speech rights around the world. Kevin, I want to come back to the United States for just a bit before we, because the purpose of the discussion is to talk about it globally, but in the United States, among the challenges, and it's really not a press issue, but it is an issue that does involve the press, the voting rights efforts, the voter suppression efforts, the changes in the way people are allowed to vote in this country seems to be the next challenge for the democracy, the next challenge for the country, the press, the leadership. Are there things that we should be watching for as the media as these processes go forward?
Well, I'm hardly a voting rights expert. Although voting, I mean, obviously voting is very important. It is the ultimate embodiment of petitioning the government for redress of grievances, one of the five freedoms in the First Amendment. I think the press's role should be to write authoritatively, critically, accurately on what is going on and pull no punches on this most important of rights that we have in this country, the right to vote independently. I think that we're starting to see that. For a while, it was sort of considered taking sides if you really picked, and called out too much of restriction, too many things that you were seeing on restriction of voting rights that might have happened here or there or there or there, and not explaining it well enough why this matters and what the big picture is. I think we're seeing that much better now. And that's what I think is important in the context of our discussion of freedom of the press, is really being the fact checkers on this. And I will cite my hometown paper that did a very good job of this, the Washington Post, this past weekend in its opinion section, where it not only wrote articles about the attacks on voting rights and generally democracy and how voting rights would factor into that, how coming toward 2022 and 2024, different changes have occurred either at the local level or attempts in law or just general pressures or disinformation campaigns. But they tied it all together. They made it relatable. They made it understandable. I think one of the columns was 18 things to look at as you try to decipher the attack on voting rights. And even someone as simple as me could understand it. On the other side, you have a piece that a lot of people I know have talked about by Barton Gellman in The Atlantic recently, which I believe took about an hour to read. So there is something for everyone out there. And I think that's important too, a variety of ways to cover it, to reach different audiences, all of which connects the dots and doesn't just point fingers.
It's the art of storytelling, and
yes.
Best storytellers are the best writers who can make that information become relatable and actionable, if you will, as people see what's coming down the line. Let me remind our participants tonight, the people who are watching us have this discussion. If you have questions for Kevin, if you have questions about global politics or global press freedoms, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen to pose that question. I'll pass it along. Otherwise, you will continue to discuss. Kevin, going back broadly internationally, what are the hotspots beyond? We've talked about Russia. We've talked a little bit about the Philippines. Where are the other hotspots where press freedoms are on the decline and we ought to be paying closer attention to what's happening?
None of these will be a surprise. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that to this point in 2021, I believe it was their study, 293 journalists have been jailed worldwide in 2021. The leaders in that area are China, Myanmar, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Belarus. So the usual suspects, frankly.
So not much that we can do except, through coercion or through shaming, getting these administrations, these regimes to change their spots, to change their ways. It's sort of disheartening for a guy like me who's spent so much time in journalism to look at what's happening overseas and say, it's got to be better than this. We've got to do more than this. I'm interested to know what some of we talked last week about the Open Government Partnership. I see they were having a summit on democracy this month as well. How successful have their efforts been to try to shed light on what's going on and perhaps make changes?
Again, a lot of that was more symbolic than not, but I think it did two things. The Open Government Partnership, which of course we did helped create in a joint, were one of the organizers of this, the creators of the Open Government Partnership a decade ago, but withdrew from entirely during the Trump administration. Again, very symbolic there. I think it did a couple of things, though. It did help engage the world. It did help show the world our best practices. It also required a certain level of internal soul searching and review that is always necessary for even the United States, which has been one of the leaders on open government generally. We again, an area where we could be doing better, where we tend to be slipping a little bit in terms of the application of our Freedom of Information Act at the federal level, could be better. I was an advocate of this when I was in private practice and representing journalism organizations, as I know you were, and I had worked a lot with people from the Society of Professional Journalists and other journalism organizations on this very issue as members of the News Media for Open Government Coalition, previously called the Sunshine in Government Initiative, to specifically improve the situation of access to government information. And that is what the Open Government Partnership did. We had to come up with our own standards internally to then take to the world, which was a very useful exercise to go through. And to take those best practices to other countries was very valuable for them as well. And to re-engage on this training of journalists, advocates, lawyers overseas. I was brought to the Gambia by a nonprofit to do a training program on media law for, again, journalists, advocates, lawyers. And I think that what we were doing was not only teaching them best practices in law, but best practices in advocacy, and to some extent, best practices in journalism. And it was that third part, all three parts of the stool, I in my write-up after the program, I recognized were necessary, would continue to be necessary, and may never be achieved. But I think that's where the U.S. can really invest, is not only in demonstrating and helping to write model laws, but helping to train the people that need to be advocates for that law, and helping to train the journalists to ensure that, they're going to be scrutinized constantly. They're going to be attacked constantly. So their margin for error is so slim. So, you think about how much people who consider the media, the journalists, the enemy of the people of the United States, jump on every last mistake, no matter how great or how minor, to prove why journalism is disinformation, is fake news, shouldn't be trusted, trust my message, not theirs. But imagine what it's like in one of these other countries where the attacks are so much more prevalent, so much more severe. They have to get it right. And that has to be considered in our outreach, I think, as well.
Is the model, or is the discussions that you have when you go to the Maldives or to the Gambia, is it always the same structure, the same template, or are you modifying it for each individual locale? Are the things that we're talking about, press freedoms and speech rights, the same around the world, or do you really have to? Is there a single template that you're using?
Personally, I used a single framework, which would always focus on, again, best practices that we had. And I would do my research to look at the situation, both just legal and professional, in these countries, and try to modify the general framework of the topics we were going to cover, the best practices we were going to espouse, to what was happening in that country at that time, and try to keep it much more of a conversation. And one example I'll give that explains, I think, a lot of what we were dealing with was in the Gambia. We were talking about access to information in the courthouse. And I was talking about the right to attend trials, to report on trials, the right to inspect documents, the right to copy documents, the right to publish court documents, even if technically they were sealed. If, again, we have this concept in the United States that is foreign to so many other countries, that truthful information that has lawfully been obtained can be published. That does not exist anywhere else. And in the Gambia, that part of the discussion devolved into a debate amongst the journalists in the room over whether something would constitute a tip or a bribe in terms of giving something to a government official to get documents. So I was actually totally caught off guard by that. But that's an example of kind of where you're dealing with different standards, you're dealing with different practices. I made clear that in no instance was either acceptable ethically, but this is what you have to do. You have to find the best practice, but then modify to the situation.
Well, looking at the Gambia as sort of a model, not specifically on this subject, do you think that the concept of the First Amendment, that the legislature or the government shall make no law to limit what the press can report, do you think that language has any, would that language survive, or would that have any chance of becoming law in some of these nations around the world where there is more than a passing outbreak of democracy? Is there an opportunity to enshrine First Amendment rights in other countries?
I think there is, but I think it's very hard. And this goes back to a couple of the things I've already mentioned, the rule of law. So specific to the Gambia, when I was there, and this was, I want to say 2012, 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in the Gambia were Nigerian. They were imported by the president. So right there, rule of law is gone. All right. It is essentially, the Supreme Court essentially becomes a prosecutorial arm of the government. All right. That is a big problem in a lot of these countries. A second problem is, as I said, with regard to the Gambia and many other countries I've seen, the lack of training for journalism and the difference in the experience is obvious to some degree. And it's not their fault. I mean, again, there's been no free press. So there's no way to create a training system for free press. There's been no way to create the experience that these people need to improve, short of sending them out of the country for training, which is often itself very hard. So what happens then is, as I said, you have inferior reporting to some degree by some outlets, which then affects everybody, drags everybody down, and will result in opportunism by the government to ratchet back the First Amendment rights. Finally, we have a law which, as you said, seems very absolute on its face. 45 words starting with "Congress shall make no law," and then laying out the 5 freedoms. And I would say this is not, now we're going to get away from even the most restrictive countries, the most repressive countries, to even Western democracies. We have very few explicit exceptions to that. Yes, we know there are exceptions. In the United States, the First Amendment does not protect certain areas of what we might call low value categories of speech, like obscenity. We talked about defamation, incitement to imminent lawless violence, true threats, fighting words, things like that. But in other countries, enshrined in their constitution are other exceptions that bump up against the protection for freedom of expression. In the European Convention on Human Rights, there are exceptions for the right to privacy. So the right to expression can be undercut entirely. And these days, the trend in many of these countries is to prioritize privacy over freedom of expression. That's the European Convention on Human Rights has these exceptions to the freedom of expression that's enshrined in Article 10. That's very different than what we have here. That's very dangerous to free speech.
The other thing that Europeans have is this right to be forgotten.
Yes.
How does it play out in this effort to try to make sure the press is free and the public has what it needs to know?
And that's an offshoot of that. That is an example of the right to privacy that has essentially become an equivalent fundamental right to freedom of expression in Europe. Yes, the right to be forgotten essentially says that if I am someone who years ago had an article written about me that is perhaps even true, but embarrassing, but invades my privacy, years later, I can go and have it delisted from major search engines. It doesn't say that I can have it necessarily removed from a particular website, but I can make, it creates a practical obscurity. It's all but impossible to find if it's not on one of the major search engines, which, and that's how the concept works. And it's getting closer and closer to the United States. It started in Europe. It was, it's been endorsed and approved by the European Court of Human Rights, and now it's made its way to Canada. And we're seeing attempts to try to bring it into the United States. But again, the First Amendment does protect that. It does protect against the application of the right to be forgotten in the United States.
So we don't have to worry about someday in the next 5 years trying to go to an archive to look for information about somebody who has had it expunged. At the First Amendment, that First Amendment will trump any legal effort to try to remove the record.
The First Amendment will, yes. I won't say that we won't have to worry about that, because again, there are certain instances in which a media outlet will voluntarily do that, but there's no obligation to do so. And that is internally, ethically, among a lot of journalists and editorial boards, that is a topic of discussion. Now, as I like to say, I'm a lawyer. I know nothing about ethics, journalism or otherwise. But it's a valid topic to discuss, as long as we put up that wall that says you don't have to do it. The law will not make you do it, because there is still value in access to that information. And when I was in private practice, I had clients that would be on the receiving end of threats from lawyers representing a client who said, my client was arrested for drunk driving 5 years ago. That has since been expunged from his record, and therefore we are demanding that you remove it from your archive. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't, the expungement of a criminal record, as valid as it may be in some situations, as useful as it may be, doesn't erase the fact of history.
Right.
And doesn't erase the truth of the article that was originally written 5 years ago. And that's what the First Amendment protects. It protects the right to seek and report the truth.
As we're getting down to the final few minutes here, Kevin, I have a couple of much broader questions. In terms of the First Amendment, in terms of press freedoms, in terms of the things we're talking about tonight, what keeps you awake at night? What causes you the most anguish during the day?
I do. What causes me the anguish, and this probably leads into what I think will be your next question, is I really am anguished by the eroding support for and belief in journalism, which I consider to be so valuable and crucial to our democracy. It to me always has been and always will be, and that does keep me awake at night. The concerted attempts to, as I said before, delegitimize the reporting of journalists that we know to be true keeps me awake at night. A corollary to that keeps me awake at night is the lack of media literacy on the part of the public to understand. And this is not, this is really pretty widespread. And it really bothers me that even smart people I know will cite articles that are clearly lacking in valid sourcing, will cite opinion articles as news, will not recognize clear bias when they see it, and won't, and won't ask critical questions as they read something. That's what bothers me and concerns me.
Is there more that needs to be done on media literacy? Is there a broader campaign to help people cut through the opinion, the misinformation from what I would like to call responsible professional journalism?
I think you know the answer to this, Steve, and I think you agree with me that the answer is a clear yes. How we do it is debatable. Whether we can do it and accomplish it is uncertain, but it has to happen. I try it. I mean, I think, and part of what journalists and anyone viewing this can do is use their platform to. We hear this word a lot within the media from journalists on panels, speaking generally, writing in articles. We need to be more transparent, and I think that is very true. But they also need to use their abilities to educate and explain, to their friends, to their neighbors, how media literacy works and how to better their own media literacy.
Yeah, getting behind the veneer of what comes out in the press, what comes out on TV. People making of the sausage, as some people would describe it, is not always clean and not always pretty to look at, but it helps to demystify the process of how a story got to be a story and helps explain why a particular news organization reported a story in a certain way.
And it makes those faults.
Yeah. And I have come to my final question, and it's the final question we asked all of our guests who appear on IC Talks, what does press freedom mean to you?
Everything. I mean, no, it really means democracy to me. It really does. It means the ability to have a dedicated watchdog over government. I try not to elevate the press over the public. I see the press as a surrogate for, an extension of the public. That's why I am so invested in keeping community journalism alive. Because again, I see the connection to community first, to journalists as the representatives of their community, the protectors of their community. So maybe that's what press freedom is watchdog, it's protection, it is community. So I think that what journalists do there is they are the first line of defense. They're the strongest defense. And while I don't want to elevate them, journalists do have particular skills, particular training, particular ability, particular strength to represent their communities in this way. And that's what press freedom means to me. It means the representation of our communities in the furtherance of democracy via watchdog journalism.
And it's interesting to note that 230 years ago, when Congress ratified, or the country ratified, the Bill of Rights, which included the First Amendment, the press was a much different animal than it is today. It was much more, not quite citizen journalism, but there were a lot more opportunities for people to have their views expressed in printed publications, in the broadsheets that existed in various parts of the 13 original states. We have moved over 230 years in a much different direction, but the rigor of the press, the rigor of journalism, and the role as a watchdog on government and on society really hasn't diminished. If anything, it's gotten to be more important. It's more critical that power be held accountable, that those in public office be held accountable for their actions, for their statements, and so forth. So while the press as an animal has changed over 230 years, the obligations, I don't think, and I think you agree, really haven't changed either.
Well, I'm not even, you mentioned a key word there, animal, one that I referenced in my answer, watchdogs. I think the press has been, is, and will remain the strongest watchdogs we have against a corrupt government.
Kevin, you couldn't have said it better. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Thanks for the insights, the stories from overseas on your international travels, and success in some parts of the world to help preserve and promote press freedoms. Thanks very much. Kevin Goldberg is a First Amendment specialist at the Freedom Forum. And before that, he has practiced media law for more than 25 years. Kevin, thanks very much again. Have a good holiday season.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being here.
The next SPJ IC Talk will be on January 11th on steps that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is taking to protect its journalists from physical and online attacks. The guests are CBC Editor-in-Chief Brodie Fenlon and Audrey Law, the CBC's head of digital news. We have more interesting discussions over the next couple of months. To learn more about the community's programs, stop by the website. Dan Kubisky has put up the link in the chat window. You can also subscribe to the community's weekly newsletter at the website or by dropping us a note at spj.internationalcommunity@gmail.com. We also post information on our Facebook page. Again, thank you, Kevin. Thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. Stay healthy. Have a good holiday. I'm Steve Geimann. Good night.